Good evening. I feel I have way too many things to try to hold at the same time, so I will try to navigate this. Sorry. Okay, so my name is Yaëlle Biro. I am the assistant curator for African art here at the museum and the curator of the exhibition African Art New York and the Avant-Garde, which sparked the idea of this evening. And I am here with Jack Flam, who is Professor Emeritus of the University of New York, and who has been an eminent scholar in modern art, but also a very knowledgeable scholar in African art as well, and who has been writing on both topics and notions of primitivism as well. So it's really great to have him here. He, one of the important writing of the past, I would say decade maybe, was the anthology called Primitivism and 20th Century, where that gathered all the writing on the topic of primitivism for the entire 20th century. So, and Jack Flam was the co-author of that book. I think we have a very nice crowd tonight, even if it is the first day of the summer. So thank you for being here. The last version of this talk was supposed to take place in just on Blizzard Day in February, and it had been rescheduled today. So we have the two sides of the spectrum of the weather. So thank you for being here on both occasions. Just as a little introduction, why, when, how, and why African art came to New York? Why this title? And the reason why I thought this would be a pertinent title is that it actually, it's a quote, it's a reference to an unpublished book by Marius de Zayas, who was an African art and a modern art dealer in New York during the 1910s. And in that publication that he wrote during the 1940s as a memoir of his involvement with modern art and African art in New York during the 1910s and 20s, he titles it, as you can see, When, How, and Why Modern Art Came to New York. So it's a little bit of a twist on that idea. And in this book, he has an entire chapter on African art and his involvement with arts coming from the African continent. And there is in particular one quote by him that I thought would launch the conversation with Jack, and maybe I should be turning to you, so it's okay. That, yes, would help launching the conversation tonight. So I will read it, bear with me. It's not very long, but. Through Picabia, I met Apollinaire, the poet, and through Apollinaire, I met Paul Guillaume, then a modest but ambitious art dealer and collector, or rather importer of Negro art. How he imported it will always remain a mystery, but the objects he had were always genuine. When the First World War was declared and desolation reigned about artists and dealers, Paul Guillaume was only too glad to let me have all the African sculptures I could put in a trunk and bring to New York. That was his first contribution to exhibitions of modern art in New York. Many others followed, if not with the same intention of making propaganda pure and simple, with the hope of opening a market for them, which was just as legitimate. So in that paragraph, I think we touch upon all the things that we're going to be speaking about, or at least many of the points we're going to be speaking about tonight, which are the central role of the European connection in the development of an art market for African art in New York, a constant concern that the dealers in New York were having for the quality of the works that were being brought from Africa, because they were lacking comparative examples. And especially the symbiotic relationship between modern and African art. And one part of that quote that to me is really central is when he says that all these objects coming from Europe through the bias of Paul Guillaume, who was a dealer in Paris, were his first contributions to exhibition of modern art. So somehow African art and modern art are becoming one. And I think this is something that will, that we can see constantly during that entire era. So we're in the year 1914. It's right after the Armory Show of 1913. African art is starting to be brought to New York in the aftermath of the Armory, so really in conjunction with modern art. And in all the displays of African art in New York at that time, we see a constant juxtaposition of modern art and African art.
as in the Picasso-Braque show on the left-hand side. Can you hear me? Picasso-Braque show on the left-hand side, or as you can see, there's a Kota sculpture on the wall. This is a kind of comparison that happens constantly from 1914. In fact, actually, the first time that we know of this happened was in 1913 in Germany, where there was a traveling exhibition of Picasso and African art. And Yaëlle was saying to me before we started tonight that actually there are an incredible number of Picasso and African art shows happened over the years, starting in 1913. And in 1923, there was such a show at the Whitney Museum on the right-hand side. And what's so interesting about this particular year, 1923, for Picasso and African art, is that the first exhibition in the United States of African art as art, independent of modern art, was at the Brooklyn Museum in 1923. And so this exhibition is kind of coordinated to some degree or seen in tandem with the Brooklyn Museum exhibition.
So one has to think that this is really the very beginning of African objects being seen as works of art in general during that era in the West. You know, until then, African objects were being seen as ethnographica, as curiosities, were mostly exhibited in ethnographic museums, in displays that really had nothing to do with the type of displays that you see here, where in fact these objects of African art, coming from Africa, and we will in a little bit about where these objects were actually coming from, they're displayed as works of modern art. They really look, you know, here we have a comparison between an installation view of the first exhibition organized at Alfred Stieglitz Gallery of African Art in 1914 called Statuary in Wood by African Savages, The Root of Modern Art, which is a title that I always love to say and point out to get the reaction of the crowd. So I want to hear more oh and as, because it really symbolizes the entire spirit of the time period and the relationship that people were, the way people were understanding African art in New York during that period.
Right, and this gets to something that I think is very interesting, which has to, well, two things. First of all, there is, on the left-hand side, that's a hornet's nest in the foreground there. And so it's a very odd, I mean, if you think about it for a moment, it's very odd to have a hornet's nest in the middle of an art exhibition. I'm sorry, can you hear me better now?
Oh, yes.
Okay. It's very odd to have a hornet's nest in the middle of... I'll do my best. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me better now? Okay. So it's very odd to have a hornet's nest in the middle of an art exhibition. And I think it's a kind of symbol or token of what one might call a kind of residual primitivism. That is to say that somehow or other, these objects, even though they're being seen as art, as is reflected in the word and title, savages, somehow are connected to a world that's more primitive, that goes back in time and goes back to, let's say, an earlier state of human consciousness. And this, I think, brings out a theme that runs through a great deal of writing about African art in relation to modern art throughout the 20th century, actually. I was going to say in the early 20th century, but actually it goes all the way to the Primitivism show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1984, which was so controversial. And that is a combination of enormous admiration mixed with condescension. And the admiration is genuine and passionate, but the condescension is also genuine. And the condescension, or I should say bridging the condescension and the admiration, is a kind of nostalgia. That is to say, within modern society, a nostalgia for a supposedly pure state of existence that people, everyone, once lived in. It's like a kind of a fall from grace, and you're looking back at something that is pre-lapsarian, and which is evoked, I think, very much by that hornet's nest. And by the way, if any of you have been to the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, that whole museum is installed, I would say, in that spirit of somehow bringing you to a dark rainforest sort of environment. On the right-hand side is...
The slide you're pointing to really isn't the one before? The nest is in the slide before?
No, it's right there.
Okay.
Can you point it out? There it is.
I thought it was in the one.
No, there it is.
It's on the one before. It's on the one before as well. It is actually the same harness nest that is being used in both displays.
They're in both.
You're right. Yeah. And I think that beyond the hornet's nest, it's also the entire bunch of flowers. So we have this very crisp modernist display, which look almost like the exhibition of works by Brancusi that the Stieglitz gallery, that Stieglitz organized right before the African Art Show. It's both in the fall 1914. But in one case, I guess he did add a little bouquet of flower, but it's quite minimalist in comparison. And in the African Art Show, it's this gigantic wilderness bunch there up front, mixed with an animal component with the hornet's nest. So it's really emphasizing, and it's a very strong contrast with the very, modernist, sleek display of the African sculptures. Yes.
Did Brancusi come in contact with the African art in Paris, and is that one reason that he developed at least some of his style, including the linear?
Sure. So can everybody hear the questions up front, or should I repeat them in the back? I repeat them. Yeah, the question is about Brancusi's influence of African art, more or less. And
The African art market.
And sure, yes.
Yes, and Brancusi was very much engaged with African art. And in fact, the large figure in the foreground, in the slide on the right, is a sculpture called First Steps, and which he destroyed. He was unhappy with, and I think he was unhappy with it partly because the sculpture stands very awkwardly in relation to gravity. Without wanting to get into too much of a digression, I think one of the really marvelous aspects of African sculpture is the way in which it is three-dimensional, occupies real space, but somehow or other seems to transcend gravity. And I think that in part because within its own context, the spiritual force of African sculpture is related to the way in which it is not rooted within the here and now, but transcends time and the actual space that it's in, even though it actually occupies space. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary aspects of African sculpture, and it's something actually that Carl Einstein, who wrote the first book about African sculpture, remarked on in a kind of indirect way. And so I think that part of the reason that Brancusi was unhappy with that sculpture on the right-hand side is that the African influence, if you will, or the African inspiration was kind of ill-absorbed. Can we have the next one? Whereas in 1921, when he did Adam and Eve on the right-hand side, it's hard to imagine that he could have ever done this sculpture without having known African sculpture. But at the same time, it doesn't look like any particular African sculpture, and it also, by the way in which he plays the multiple bases against each other, it also transcends gravity. It also is sculpture that you could say has a kind of ambivalent relationship between sort of mass and volume. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, it was a very strong influence, and one of the things that
he always denied it a little bit.
Well, of course he denied it, but Picasso denied it too. In 1920, when someone asked Picasso, "What about African art?" and he said, "We never heard of it." He said, "Je ne connais pas." They don't know anything about it. So I mean, I remember actually an artist friend saying to me years ago, if you really want to know who an artist is influenced by, pay attention to who he doesn't mention when he talks about his influences. And I think there's a lot to be said, or the denials, the outright denials. So I think one of the things also, in the way in which modern artists relate to African art, it's the artists who are the most imaginative, who get to the kind of the core of what is with the sort of structural principles of African art without getting too much caught up in the surface that really makes the most sense. So it's not, maybe it's just me, just like,
So
I just can't handle a crooner's mic.
So maybe as we're speaking about the idea of the influence of African works on modern art, maybe it's the right time to just jump and think a little bit about the exhibition Primitivism in 20th Century Art, which you already mentioned, which took place in 1984 at MoMA, and which was really a turning point for the understanding, I guess, of a general public, not only of really that idea of primitivism, of the influence of African objects on modern art from the beginning of the 20th century, which is an undeniable influence that existed. That exhibition received a lot of heat afterwards. It was criticized extensively because I believe anthropologists essentially reacted to the fact that the African objects were there as a side story to modern art and weren't given a place in their own right, and that it was unfortunate that African objects needed to be seen in the modern art context in order to be appreciated for what they were. So that was, I mean, I'm just giving a
yeah, and they were deracinated to some degree, one could say.
Yes. And because Jack was involved with that exhibition and wrote an essay in the catalog as a Matisse specialist, I thought that it would be nice to hear his take on that show, and also how maybe 30 years later we look at that moment and how things have evolved in that sense.
Okay, so I'll give you the short version, because the long version would take the rest of the hour at least, which was at the time that the show was being planned, I was teaching a seminar at the Graduate Center on called Primitivism and Modern Art, or Primitivism and 20th Century Art. And I was actually planning to write a short book on the subject. And Bill Rubin at MoMA got in touch with me and asked me if I would, he said he was doing this big exhibition, would I write an essay for the catalog? And I thought, well, okay, in that case, if they're doing a big exhibition, I'm not going to write a book, which I didn't. The book that I did later was an anthology. And what I'm going to, I'll write for the catalog. Well, the thing that was interesting to me is that my graduate students had a very different attitude toward, it was a seminar. So I lectured for 6 or 7 weeks, and then for the next 6 or 7 weeks, the students gave reports. And I was lecturing about, the history of the encounter between modern art and African art, and to some degree, oceanic art. And my students, on the other hand, were doing very different kinds of reports. They were very much interested with performance artists. They were very much interested with American artists of color who were both rejecting and doing riffs on their African heritage. And at that moment, I thought, well, this is interesting because this field needs a different perspective. The catalog for the Primitivism show, however, was very much in the traditional mold. And the African objects, and the so-called primitive objects, were in fact deracinated. It's as if they had not been done at any particular moment in history. The show largely ignored the fact that most of the objects in the exhibition that were not American or European had been done in the 19th and early 20th centuries themselves. And they were done in time, and they were objects in history. And the show got really slammed. Not only that, I think that part of what happened is that the curators of the show, the main organizers, William Rubin and Kirk Varnadoe, were completely blindsided. They didn't realize why they were being criticized, because they had done as they saw it, and they were right as far as they saw it. They had done a really good job. The essays in the catalog were on the whole very good. The catalog is still being used as a reference work, but in a very specific, narrow context. And in a certain way, it was, one would have thought, the last gasp of a certain kind of study of primitivism. Now, having said that, then in subsequent years, so one of the things Thomas McEvilley talked about in a very amusing and bittersweet series of articles and letters to the editor between him and the organizers of the show, was the fact that none of the African objects had dates on them. As if, they didn't exist. They're people without history. They were done by a people without history, and that's one of the things that the anthropologists complained about. A couple of years later, I was in a museum, which shall go unnamed, which was an African art museum. And I was looking at objects that were on display, and none of them had dates. And this is several years afterwards. And I have to say that although I love the collection at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, which incorporates, among other things, the old Musée de l'Homme collection, I have to say I liked the old Musée de l'Homme better because I don't like that kind of idea that you have to be brought to a forest in order to appreciate the art that you're looking at in the museum.
And this idea of not including any dates is something that for the exhibition upstairs I really had to think about, because we all here at the museum, we always include dates on the label, also in the permanent galleries. But it's true that a lot of our collection is mostly late 19th, early 20th century. We have a few works that date, maybe possibly as early as the 12th century. We have one terracotta sculpture from the 12th century. But otherwise, it's really mostly late 19th, early 20th century objects. And for the exhibition, for African Art New York and the Avant-Garde, it's even a little trickier because I did end up including a number of works that were probably created just a few years before they were exported and before they arrived in France. So we're there with works that arrived in Paris and then in New York in 1914, and that might have been created in 1912. And so what do you put on these? Because we still don't know exactly. So I could still just put late 19th, early 20th century. But then I added in parentheses the collecting date, or at least we know that it was collected before 1914. So that was a little addition just for that specific show, just to give a little bit more of a time frame, even if it's not perfect at all, and it doesn't really tell us much more about when the objects were actually created. There is a question. Yes?
Leading up to the MoMA exhibit, was the MoMA exhibit such a work that juxtaposed African art with, quote, modern art, and was that part of the problem, like we saw earlier on in the sequence, and they should have maybe had the African art stand alone like we have in the current exhibit?
So that's the exhibition at MoMA was great masterpieces of modern art, shown next to works from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas that had some possible visual affinities to try to highlight the response that artists were having to these arts. So one of the things that the curators were criticized for as well was that a lot of the juxtapositions they were making were actually completely arbitrary, and we knew that the artist actually did not get to see that type of mask that they had put next to. So it wasn't enough of a historical reconstitution. I think that was also the problem. And so,
right.
Yeah, for me, working on the exhibition upstairs was, learning the lessons from primitivism from the MoMA show 30 years later, still acknowledge the importance of African art on modern art, and that moment that shaped modern art, by this, when artists started to look at African objects as a source of inspiration. So acknowledge that moment, but at the same time, really think about it in a historical context and really only focus specifically on works that were shown together at the same time, works by modern artists that were exhibited next to these specific objects of African art at that specific moment in time. So it's much more for historical
Right, and I think there's another issue, and I think it's an unreconcilable issue, it's an unresolvable issue, and that's the issue of us and them. That is to say, the MoMA show was very Western-centric, Eurocentric, maybe would be a more proper word, because there was an American section, but it was mostly European. So it was very Eurocentric. So the idea is how Europeans stole ideas from African artists and then kind of marginalized the African artists. And that was one of the reasons that it was criticized. And, it's part of a cultural dialogue that's very hard to resolve. I mean, I know, for example, African-American artist friends of mine are, in a certain way, also us, not them. In other words, if you're in a culture, the culture that you're in is where you are centered, and everything that's outside of that culture is something that you are going to appropriate, and in appropriating, you're going to distort in some way. And, you know, this is something, as a result, that it's very difficult to reconcile with the anthropological attitude, because the anthropological attitude is the anthropologist tries, in principle, to not be one of us, but to become, have all the sympathies be with being one of them. And so, but this is not the way artists operate necessarily. You know, who was it that said, good artists borrow, great artists steal? And I think that, you know, so part of what that show was criticized for, justifiably criticized for, though, had to do with this theft process and the idea, which I think is a really very problematical idea, is that modern artists became aware of African art just at the height of the exploitation of Africa. That is the political exploitation, the raw materials exploitation. So these two things are coterminous. And one of the issues that came up with the show is, isn't this really a kind of colonialist attitude that the show was
Yes, there are
promoting?
questions already. I guess we won't even have to do a Q&A
We
at
won't
the
have
end.
a
Go ahead.
Q&A afterwards.
I saw that exhibition. Would you say that in defense of it, it was documenting a moment in time, and so that in the early 20th century, that was the view and understanding of African cultures?
So the question is whether the exhibition at MoMA in 1984 wasn't documenting a specific moment in time, the moment at the beginning of the 20th century when artists were looking at African objects and non-Western art as a source of inspiration. But I think that they weren't clear about, if that was the case, they didn't spell it out. You know, I tried to spell it out for the exhibition upstairs. It is a moment in time that we're looking at. But the show actually was going all the way up, you know, to the
present,
to
the
the
contemporary
present.
art.
Yeah, yeah. It really included contemporary art. It wasn't just about Picasso and Matisse and Derain, who were the first to. It was the concept of
Yes.
primitivism it was looking at, but it wasn't very clear in that historical perspective. It didn't have the distance, maybe.
Well, I think one criticism could be something you mentioned, is that it wasn't always accurate. That is to say, if you got, you know, a modern object that, and you could find an African object or an oceanic object that looks somewhat like it, even though that artist may never have been able to see it, they put the two of them together. Yeah, and that was harder to defend. But, you know, as many of you know, there's a lot of controversy around Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And I've read a number of the people who have written about it, and it's very hard to take a definitive position. I myself think it's a masterpiece, and I think that Conrad's sympathies are with humanity at large, all of humanity. But I understand that there is a cultural critique of Heart of Darkness, which, read a different way, can seem to really stand for a condescending colonialist attitude. Yes.
I remember that exhibit quite well, and I went often to see it. But I think there was an attitude, a much more sensitized culture about cultural imperialism, and seeing these objects only as an adjunct. And I think since then, the sensitivity is still there, but that we have learned to look at the objects in their own context. And I'm always looking for the historical sense of original purpose and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hate that exhibit.
And I think it was very important for a
That's
lot of people.
Yeah, and that's very well said too. The kind of, you know, imperialist attitude.
I think it was a very important exhibition for many collectors, for many people who actually discovered African arts in that exhibition and who had never really paid attention to it. So it was very important at the time, and it's still very valuable, for what it was. But the criticism that came afterward was also very interesting in shaping even African art scholarship, I think, until today. I mean, the years that followed, it really completely transformed the way scholars have been studying African art since then. And interestingly, the history of African art collecting kind of stopped being looked at following that exhibition. That's really my feeling, is that it became too much of a burning topic. Nobody really wanted to get into that idea of that question of primitivism with the risk of getting their wings burned. So for 30 years, really the study of that moment at the beginning of the 20th century has stopped. So, for somebody like me who really likes archives and history of collecting, it was a real treat to be able to go in archives and see things that nobody had really been looking at for 30 years and dig out a lot of new information about what was actually happening during that era, even if it was information that had been accessible for many, many years. Nobody had been willing to really look into it because just the idea of looking at that era felt risky.
That's a good point. The whole activity became tainted to some degree because of the criticism of that show. And then there were the subsequent shows. There was Magicien de la Terre in Paris, which then had 50 Western artists and 50 artists from other parts of the world, and that was criticized.
That was in Paris.
In a similar way. And I think the curator, Jean-Hubert Martin, was as astonished as William Rubin and Kirk Barnardo were, because he thought that he was doing a corrective exhibition, and it turned out that he got the similar kind of criticism. And then there was an exhibition at the Museum for African Art when it was still up in the Upper East Side called Africa Explores that Susan Vogel did, which was actually a very interesting exhibition because it was actually Afrocentric in a nice way. And I remember Susan had a seminar, an all-day seminar, and a number of African artists, contemporary African artists who were in the show, spoke at the seminar, and it was really, really interesting. And there were certain artists, people who have become very well known now, who were being shown in New York for the first time there. So I mean, the 1984 show really shook things up, and it had enormous consequences, including your beautiful little show.
Yeah. I thought maybe we would continue with some more of the images that we selected from the exhibition. And here we have a group of 2 photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe by Alfred Stieglitz showing 2 sculptures. One, this little female torso by Matisse on the left, and then in the other photograph, a spoon from Côte d'Ivoire that you see as well. So they're all shown in the exhibition as some sort of a quadruptych, all shown together. And my intention with that grouping was to show how, at the same time, Stieglitz was looking at both sculptures, which somehow can both be seen as female torsos, both Matisse and the spoon, how he was using them in the same manner as props in both photographs. Georgia O'Keeffe herself is almost a prop. He's just positioning the different elements in his photograph and taking the picture. However, of course, in the photograph with the African spoon, we have this whole erotic dimension that comes out very clearly, where the spoon is transformed itself into an erotic object, and Georgia O'Keeffe is denuded. And I think it's, again, this residual primitivism that you were talking about earlier that we find again, is that they're used as props. Both objects are used in the same manner as works of art as well. But with the African sculpture, we enter in this whole phantasmagoric idea of Africa and the Orient also, and 19th century Orientalism comes to mind, and exoticism in general.
Right, and the sort of exotic, erotic formula, which is very clearly seen in both of these. The Matisse sculpture, by the way, is obviously very strongly influenced by African sculpture. Matisse was one of the earliest collectors of African art, and you see that very clearly there. And as Yaëlle was saying, picture on the right, George O'Keeffe, I mean, it's so the phallic overtone of the spoon, the way he's photographed it, is so strong, so strongly emphasized. Whereas when he photographs the Matisse sculpture, it's actually almost hard to read. And curiously enough, even though the sculpture itself is very clearly sort of bursts with energy and a certain eroticism, as it appears next to Georgia O'Keeffe, it's almost as if her kind of smoldering look sort of overpowers the sculpture to some degree. But I think in both of these there is yet another formula which is not so different from the primitivist formula, which is of admiration and condescension, of passion and condescension. And I think that one could say, without wanting to push it too far, that women in general are the other great, how shall I say it, oppressed minority, even though not really a minority, throughout much of Western history. And I think the way in which the sculptures are used here seems to me to kind of refer to that, I think, unconsciously.
And also, again, this notion of the objects removed entirely from their original context. It's something that we've already been hitting at now a few times, but maybe now is the time to speak about this more clearly. This is a photograph by the American artist Charles Schiller, who at the beginning of his career spent a lot of time photographing African objects. He worked in the gallery of Maurice de Zayas in Paris as a clerk and as a staff photographer, more or less, taking photographs of all the objects coming through the gallery. So there are many, many photographs by Charles Schiller of African sculptures circulating in New York during the 1910s. And this photograph was taken in 1919. It was a selection from a collection assembled by a man called John Quinn, who was a modern art collector. He owned over 2,000 works of art by the greatest modern artists of the time. He had Matisse and the Douanier Rousseau and Seurat and absolutely everybody you can think of.
And also literary manuscripts.
And yes, and a great bibliophile. Mm-hmm. And he assembled a small, but at the same time, I think the largest collection of African art in New York. He had about 40 sculptures that he assembled between 1915 and 1924, which is the year of his death. But so this photograph from 1919 really shows a selection of the genre of works that were accessible in New York at the time. And maybe I'll get to back to that in a few seconds.
Yes, and I think, I mean, once again, I just like to point out the very dramatic light, so that the way it's dramatically lit reinforces this idea of a kind of nascent primitivism, what we've been calling residual primitivism, and we were looking at it a little earlier, and I was realizing they almost look like a little forest. It's this just again this idea of the luxuriance of the woods and the jungle. I mean, you can see all sorts of things in there. And it's very provocative also in relation to the circulation of objects, which yes. So here in this photograph, we have works essentially from West and Central Africa, West and Equatorial Africa. And this will allow me to talk a little bit about where were the objects coming from in Africa and how were they circulating to New York. And that's something that I think is really fascinating, and that is one of the underlying themes of the exhibition upstairs, where works were all going, before arriving in New York, African sculptures, here we go, were arriving from France. So they were coming basically from the colonies, the French and Belgian colonies. So we've highlighted them over here. So mostly Gabon, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, we have Liberia as well, and then the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which at the time was the Belgian Congo, and was King Leopold's private property, really at the heart of Africa. And and then works were going to France and Belgium, and then from there directly to New York. So there is some sort of a European filter happening before the objects were arriving in New York, which means that by the time they arrived here, they could already be embraced
as an idea, as works of modern art almost, because they were coming together with works by modern artists. And were seen, I think, exactly in the same manner. I think a Picasso and an African sculpture, one of Picasso's Cubist painting and an African sculpture were as exotic as one another at the time for the American audience, to some extent.
Very much so.
Yeah, and somehow exhibiting them together, and this idea that there were so many exhibitions of African art and Picasso shown together during that entire era, was a way for people to try to grapple with both concepts. You know, they were both very foreign, but maybe they were trying to explain one another to some extent. So this is for the trajectories, and there is in particular a few stories that I really like to tell, so I will just guide you through the stories of a couple of objects, and coming from the Belgian Congo, so down here, and more specifically from Eastern Congo. We have a group of 3 objects in the exhibition, these 2 and this one, that are all luba from this region in Eastern Congo, and that were collected between 1913 and 1916 by a man called Joseph van der Bogaerde, who was a Belgian colonial officer who was based in Congolo, in Eastern Congo, and who assembled, as you see, a mountain of African sculptures. And when he brought them back with him, when he returned to Belgium in 1916, he took that photograph, which really shows how he was thinking also about these objects that he collected. They are mixed together with hunting trophies. You can see the lion's fur in the back, the lion's skull, and then all sorts of ivory tusks and a few arrows, but otherwise it's really mostly sculptures. So we're here in front of colonial trophies and hunting trophies put together in this big pile in front of a Belgian mansion, I guess. What is great with this photograph, and I was very excited when I saw this, is that this sculpture is actually here. And then up here you have this seat of office, a Luba seat of office. That's really one of the great masterpieces of its kind, which is used to hold that lion skull, which is quite ironic. And right here you have this little bowl bearer, also Luba, that we see right here. So what is fascinating to me is that along the way, so from Eastern Congo, then to Belgium, after that they went to Paris, they became commodities, and they entered the art market. They were sold to a man called Charles Vignier, who was based in Paris. And then he sent them to New York, to Marius de Zayas, who was this dealer very much involved in the modern art market. So these sculptures became incorporated into this idea of modernism and so on. And then they entered the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. And all this happened literally between 1913 and 1919. So we have 6 years during which at each step these objects became something else every other year and were seen in a different manner. So they were stripped from their original context as it went. And I guess they regained a little bit of this nowadays because there have been a lot of research on Luba art, and I think they have regained a lot of their history. But at that time, they were just stripped a little more of their original context along the way. Yeah, I don't know if there is anything you want to add about this. Okay.
Says it perfectly.
We have a couple other sculptures that are also seen in the exhibition upstairs that are, these 2 are from Gabon, so it's also a French colony, and they are elements of reliquary boxes. So they are usually displayed at the top of a reliquary container. And as photographed here, as you see, they're completely stripped again from that notion that they were guardians, really keeping the remains of some of the most important individuals in the Fang communities of Gabon. And these 2 sculptures, same thing, arrived in Paris. We don't know exactly when, but at least they were in Paris before 1913, and then started to be exhibited from one place to the next. So here we have again a little map. You can see where they came from here in southern Cameroon and northern Gabon, because the Fang peoples are actually on both sides of the borders. And then they went to Paris, and then we have a little map of Paris, and you see how they traveled from one dealer to the other. So at each step, again, being transformed in people's consciousness. And then they traveled to New York, where they ended up in the Zayas Gallery. And then they were sold to Walter and Louis Arensberg, and you can see them here in 1919 in the living room of Walter and Louis Arensberg, who were very prominent Dada. They hosted very prominent host, and they hosted a Dada salon in their living room daily from 1914 on, I think, right after the Armory show started.
Right, and who has it, you can see a wonderful collection of modern European art also. Matisse, Picabia, Picasso, Braque.
One thing that I really like to point out about this photograph is we're talking a lot about Brancusi, but you see the Brancusi sculpture over here. I think this is the prodigal son. And at the other end, you have that Fang reliquary element, which has been positioned by the Arensberg on that white cylindrical base, somehow transforming it into a Brancusi. They're playing again with this idea of the dark wood and the white base, which exactly in the manner that Brancusi would have done it with his own sculpture. So these objects are being transformed really into modern sculptures along the way.
Yes.
Picabia?
Yes, and then there's something else also. This is called Negro Song, and it's 1913.
Yes.
And what's really interesting is watercolor. And what's really interesting about this is the way in which Picabia is emphasizing the kind of abstract rhythmic qualities of African sculpture, but also doing something else. He in particular is aware of something that we haven't really mentioned except obliquely, which I think has an enormous force in the way African art is seen differently in the United States, and I believe it was in the early 20th century, and this is clear in your exhibition, from the way it was seen in Europe, which is that in the United States, there was a large African-American population. And somehow or other, the objects, therefore, were seen culturally in potentially a different way. So what Picabia is doing here in calling this Negro Song, he's not only alluding to the structural principles, if I can call them that, of African sculpture, he's also alluding to jazz. And so that he's making a kind of cross-cultural set of references that brings the sort of African roots of a very typically American form home in a modern work of art.
Yes, and he actually, I think in his memoir, in some letters, we know that he painted that whole series of watercolors after hearing black music for the first time, which is what he says in that letter.
Absolutely.
So there is a very literal reflection by him on that topic. And indeed, it's really, as I was working on the exhibition, I was really trying to identify what was making the difference between the reception of African art in New York and in France, because if the objects are coming from France, that basically all the dealers are going to France to acquire the objects, that a lot of the collectors are also traveling back and forth. What was making really the specifically American identity of that history? And it's true that the main element that came out is the African-American presence in New York that really changed the way, even if I think to some extent it might have been quite subtle. I don't know how aware of this the Arensberg were, for example. But I think for a number of people, it was really present.
Yeah, and I remember, and I wanted to look this up, but I didn't get around to doing it today, so I can't read you the exact words. But when the Museum of Modern Art did an African sculpture show in 1935, and that was the first time that an African art was shown in the United States, specifically in the context of a modern art museum. And what's very interesting about that show is it traveled. And when it was on the West Coast, a journalist whose name sticks in my mind because his name was Arthur Miller, but it turned out not to be the Arthur Miller, Because I remember when I first came across this article doing research for my book, I thought, wow, Arthur Miller wrote about this, but it was a different Arthur Miller. But he talked about the African sculpture in the Museum of Modern Art's 1935 show as showing how, which he found marvelous, and he'd never seen much African sculpture before, and he said, when you look at this sculpture, you can understand why Joe Louis is such a great fighter. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what he's saying. So they're trying to make he's making a kind of cultural connection of great men starting in Africa and coming to the United States. Yes.
I just wonder how American slavery fits into the scheme of things. In other words, how primitivism or the condescension part connects to the way blacks were treated in the United States, segregation that we certainly had all the way through the 60s. Does that fit into this, or is it more politically separate?
It's not. I don't think it's separate. I would say that. I mean, it's a really interesting question, which I don't think we can answer here, except in a very sketchy way. But I would say that the way in which the colonial powers in Europe treated Africans in the 19th century was very similar to the way in which African Americans were treated in the days of slavery. That is, we completely exploited. One of the things about the Belgian Congo, it was owned personally, as Yaëlle said, by King Leopold. It was one of the most horrible places in the world. I mean, what you get some sense of in Conrad's Heart of Darkness is relatively mild. And people were treated with unbelievable brutality. I think there's a whole, you've opened up a whole other theme, which is the way in which exploited populations are dealt with by the exploiters, who always, to some degree, at some point in the mutual history, romanticize the exploitation and then the post-exploitation. I mean, I think, yes.
I apologize if I misunderstood, but
If you say it a little louder, I won't have to repeat it.
I apologize if perhaps I have a misunderstanding, but I don't quite understand the point about how there was a different reception of African art from the French versus the Americans because of African Americans, because during that time, there was a huge presence of African Americans in Paris, writers, musicians, poets. So I don't understand.
Two things. First of all, it's a little later. That happens basically in the 20s after World War I, where this is the kind of the first period up through, let's say, World War I. But the other thing is, don't forget that the African Americans who went to Paris in the 1920s and 30s went to Paris because they couldn't stand it here, because they felt they were being treated like crap here. So that there was a real sense of freedom. I happened to have known in the 1970s Buford Delaney, who was a wonderful artist and was also a wonderful human being. And Buford left New York and went to Paris, and he just lived in Paris because, I mean, he told me, he felt that in New York, in the United States, he was just treated like dirt, whereas in Paris, he wasn't. And I think in part because you didn't have that same history of slavery and exploitation that was still within living memory, and an enormous amount of, the Jim Crow and segregation afterwards. So I think there really was a difference.
Talking about this whole period, 13 to 19, that was World War I.
Yes.
So what was the impact of World War I on all of this exporting of African art out of those battle zones?
Yeah, it's true that it's something that has struck me as being quite fascinating to see how fluid commerce still seemed to be during that entire period, and in that paragraph that I read at the very beginning of Desaias describing how Guillaume was just more than happy to pack as many objects as possible in a suitcase and send it over when right before the war started. So we're in June 1914, and it's exactly that moment. And it seems really that there was a constant flow back and forth across the Atlantic during the entire war period. And yeah, I'm not sure how much it.
Oh, and also, Guillaume's book in African art, which was published in 1917, right at the height of the war. Something else, by the way, I don't know how this fits in, but it's a very important, I think, element somehow, which is that during World War I, a number of African regiments fought on the French side, people from the colonies. And they were extremely effective, and that did change attitudes toward Africans in France after the war. And maybe that's part of the why also when African Americans went to France, they got a very different kind of reception.
And maybe
People, by the way, who later on were never given a pension, I should say, but.
I have a question. How many of the African artists were entrepreneurs and made these sculptures for the trade? In other words, became paid, we can make some money here. And whether that happened in the Congo, despite its horrific, whatever, policies.
So it is.
In fact, made art for the trade and hopefully got some money for it, so that it was, a commodity that they took advantage of.
It's true, and we do know now that it was happening. It's really hard to say to what extent, and I think it might also be something that is often not said much because it wouldn't be good for the market when if people started thinking that maybe a lot of these objects were created right before they were sent out or collected. But we do, it's possible to identify to some extent when a work was never used in its original context. It's lacking patina, it's lacking usage, it's, you can see that something is missing. And there is, and I did mention that earlier, there is a number of works in the exhibition that probably were never used in their original contexts and were probably created right before they were collected. They might have been carved right by the harbors in Côte d'Ivoire, in a place where there were a lot of merchants coming back and forth. And then, and these as well. And it's true, nowadays, the African art market is a very difficult art market to navigate for collectors because there are, tons and tons of different ways to classify authenticity, but that's a whole other question. Yes.
Elaborate a little bit on the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes, so that's what we were
Thank you for
planning on
that,
doing
right?
for the last 2 minutes that we have, unfortunately, but yes. So it's true that the final section of the exhibition is focusing on the Harlem Renaissance and the reappropriation by African Americans and African American artists of African art. And that was, to emphasize what we were talking about earlier and the role that how differently African art was seen in New York due to that presence on the East Coast. And so we're showing here,
Melvin Gray Johnson's painting, which is, it's a wonderful moment in the show because you see the objects that he used for the painting. And you can also see, and this is what I meant before about, us and them being inside and outside. Johnson is basically a Cubist painter, and he's painting African objects. But I would say that he's painting African objects as an American. He's an African American, but it's as an American basically. In other words, his tradition is this American tradition of modernism, which was affected by Cubism.
And so the two sculptures that you see here, it's a Gele Yoruba mask from Nigeria and a Boa mask from the Congo, were brought to New York in 1926 by Alain Locke, the philosopher, who went to Belgium in 1926 and acquired a group of about 1,000 sculptures and part of it was a lot of decorative art, cups, Cuba cups from the Congo, textiles, and also masks and figures, and brought them to New York. And his goal was to create a Harlem Museum of African Art. And he wanted it to be there for artists of the Harlem Renaissance to have access to these sculptures and to be able to be inspired by them, like he had seen artists in Paris had been inspired during the previous decade. So, and this is what Melvin Gray Johnson did. He saw these two masks at, he probably saw them at what is now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture up in Harlem, where a big part of the collection is now housed. It was the Harlem Museum for African Art actually never opened in 1929. The recession hit and they were never able to assemble the funds to open that museum. And the collection was dispersed. It actually traveled to Chicago in part and to a number of other places and universities. So some of the works were acquired along the stops, and then whatever was left entered the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library at the beginning of the 1930s. So when Melvin Gray Johnson saw these two masks, it was probably already at the New York Public Library's Harlem branch, and he painted that painting in 1932.
And this is 1927.
And this is 1927. Right. It's when a selection of these objects traveled to Chicago for that.
And the iconography is really interesting. I mean, the kind of hodgepodge of cultural references to the Egyptian pharaoh, to the wonderful traditional sculpture on the right-hand side, lower right, and then, of course, contrasted against it, Blacks in America, associated with music, performance, and very, very elegantly presented. I mean, the drawing style is elegant, so you have a wonderful mix of cultural references in this poster. And could we go to the next one? Oops. And of course, this kind of contemplation of the African object, whether by Max Weber on the right-hand side, or by James Wells on the left-hand side. And the dates of these photographs are, the Wells is 1930 and the Max Weber is around 1916. And this is also a sculpture that, a Yaka sculpture that Max Weber actually incorporated in a still life as early as 1910. The Wells the photograph of Wells, I find really interesting because in his hand he has a Cuba sculpture from what would have then been the Belgian Congo. And he himself discovered African art in 1923 at the Brooklyn Museum African Art Show. So there's a wonderful kind of cycle, and he became very much involved with African art. He's actually an extraordinarily good painter who sometimes refers to African objects, but in many of his paintings does not, but there's a kind of Cubist, modernist element to his style. But also I'd like to say one other thing, which is, okay, James Wells came to African art through the exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. There was a man just a generation before him, William Henry Shepherd, who actually had gone to the Congo. And William Henry Shepherd was the son of slaves who became a missionary. And he was the first black missionary from the United States to go to Africa as a missionary. And he worked amongst the Cuba. His papers, by the way, are in the Hampton Institute. And he's someone that for years I wanted to write a book about, but I've never gotten around to do it. Somebody really should someday write a book about him. He's an extraordinary man because he went to the Congo. He was adopted by the people in the Congo who saw him as a kind of ancestral presence who would come back to them. But he didn't just let it go at that. He also was one of the main people fighting against the Belgians for the liberation of the people in the Congo. And although he was slandered, had an awful time of things, he actually was instrumental in getting the Belgian Congo away from King Leopold and to become the Congo Free State eventually. Yes. It's William Henry Shepherd. So there's, I mean, to me, the Shepherd story has always been very moving because here you have an American, as I say, son of slaves. He may have even actually been born into slavery, I don't remember now, as a very young man, who was trained as a missionary, went to Africa, and was also very much involved with Cuba art.
Yes, and he collected himself.
He
brought the
collected, yes, I
collection.
should say. He brought, yes, yes.
And what is fascinating too is that after he came back to the U.S. and he was a professor at Hampton University,
Yes.
or
Yeah, he was, yeah.
And he recreated these Congolese scenes on the campus at Hampton. And
Yeah.
there are these amazing photographs where he is, just recreating Cuba scenes with the students on campus, with shields and costumes and everybody participating to this theatrical staging. It's very interesting. Yeah, there isn't one article that exists about him.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is how I discovered him.
One of these missionaries who kind of transformed himself and became more of an anthropologist once he was in Africa? Because there are several stories of that.
Yeah, I think generally yes. I mean, he didn't really become an anthropologist per se, but he became, yes, more of, exactly. Yes. And also a political activist. I mean, he saw these people were being very badly treated, and he wanted to do something about it, and he did.
And the one thing that I wanted to say about that pair of photographs, these are the photographs that are kind of bookending the exhibition. The Max Weber portrait, this one opens the show, and this one closes the show. And to me, what was important was to highlight the role of the artists in that whole process that we've been discussing now in all sorts of ways. And because the artists were the first to start to see these objects as works of art. And then what I noticed is that most of the dealers who were involved in the trade of African objects as art were artists also by training. So the artist was really, the notion of the artist was very prominent in shaping that field of understanding, and in shaping in the end the way we still see African art until today, was something that I thought was important highlighting.
Yes. So do you want to say do you have 2 minutes to say what would you like people to come away from the show with?
I think that just the complexity of the era is really what I think is important. We're saying how, when, and why African art came to New York, and I think we can say when, more or less, but then the how and the why just has so many answers that really can't be, covered in a discussion of an hour or even, more than that. I think it's really seeped in the period, seeped in the colonial history between Europe and the United States, seeped in American history in its own way. And there are just so many different paths that can be explored to understand what was happening at the time and then how it has impacted the way we still see African art today.
Yeah. And one thing I'd like to say is that this exhibition is extraordinary in that in a relatively small space, you packed in so much energy. That is, so much intellectual energy and so much aesthetic energy at the same time. And it really is a marvelous show.
Thank you very much. I think we'll sit there. Thank you.